Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second panel of the conference entitled Social and Political Movements. My name is Leukavets. I'm a postdoctoral researcher and a policy analyst at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and I'm going to moderate this panel discussion. Huge thanks to the organizers for setting up this conference, and I'm greatly looking forward to joining you in person after lunch. We have a great lineup of speakers today, and we will go in the order of the conference program. So the first on my list are Ruta Skriptaite and Carole Spary. They are going to speak about the rise of Belarus pro-democracy leader Svyatlana Tsikhanouskaya in the 2020 Belarusian presidential elections. Ruta is a doctoral researcher in the School of Politics and International Relations of the University of Nottingham. Her primary research explores the affinity between masculinities and political image making in the post-Soviet spaces. And since summer of 2021, she has been working with her doctoral supervisor, Dr. Carole Spary, analyzing Svyatlana Tsikhanouskaya political leadership. Ruta is very fond of oil painting, and she even had a couple of exhibitions prior to starting her PhD. Dr. Carole Spary is Associate Professor in the School of Politics and International Relations and Director of the Asia Research Institute at the University of Nottingham. She's a specialist on gender and political representation and democratic politics in Asia, especially in India. She is a co-author of Performing Representation, Women Members in the Indian Parliament, and Gender Development and the State in India. She previously held positions at the University of York and Warwick, and she holds a PhD in development politics from the University of Bristol. Ruta, Carole, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Great, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the organisers and participants for the opportunity to present our research today. I confess, as my profile sounds, I'm not a Belarusian specialist, but my excellent co-author is, and I've been immensely inspired by this project, and I'm looking forward to learning more today and in future. And I'd really like to thank everybody for welcoming this interloper today. And we very much welcome questions and feedback on the project. I'd also like to briefly acknowledge the support of the School of Politics and International Relations at Nottingham. This is part of a collaborative initiative initially funded by that school and designed to encourage co-authorship between staff and postgraduate researchers. So please, can you change slide? Thank you. So Svyatlana Tsikhanouskaya needs no introduction to this audience. She's the central focus of our paper, which is one of several papers emerging from this collaboration. Our initial focus of inquiry for the whole project was to understand the symbolic significance of Svyatlana's rise to political leadership in the Belarus 2020 election. One justification for focusing on the case is that she is, we would argue, a deviant or atypical case for women presidential candidates, both globally and regionally, in terms of how her lack of experience and credentials became an advantage rather than a disadvantage in the campaign. But that she is a more typical case in that the gendered aspects of her self-representation are familiar to studies of gender and political leadership. So drawing from the vast literature on Belarusian politics, we argue that there are key structural, agentic, and contingent factors preceding and during the 2020 election that explain Svyatlana's emergence as a candidate, which created a particular political opportunity structure and electoral appeal. However, drawing on studies of gender political leadership and symbolic representation, we also argue that specifically gendered aspects of Svyatlana's political agency and that of others, both successful strategies and mistakes, played a crucial role. We argue for the importance of contingency, specifically a kind of conjunctural causation. The particular combination and sequence of factors led to a highly specific and extraordinary outcome. Crucially, we argue that gender is a crucial explanatory factor of all three components in terms of how it enabled Svyatlana's candidacy and her electoral appeal and her subsequent international diplomatic efforts. While we acknowledge her candidacy was highly contingent, we find that Svyatlana's specific individual qualities and agentic self-representation mattered to her registration as a candidate and to her symbolic appeal and symbolic capital, her symbolic iconic imagery as a vote for change, even if temporarily, self-admittedly, and attracting support from other challenges and a broad electoral appeal. Post-election, we also find that Svyatlana's gender self-representation and extraordinary story aided her diplomatic international efforts in the post-election period. Now, saying that, we do not want to overstate the importance of Svyatlana's emergence, given the structural factors prior to 2020 and the escalating challenges that have occurred since the election. Or do we want to suggest that her leadership in exile has maintained consistent levels of support, or that she would be the most popular candidate for president were free and fair elections to be called? This was clear from the Chatham House polling data. But we do think her example offers multiple insights for multiple literatures that goes beyond Belarusian political studies as well. And I think partly that is studies that focus on primarily structural factors, those that acknowledge agency as well, but do not focus extensively on the significance of gender. Having denied several viable real opposition challenges the opportunity to contest, her candidacy, we believe, made a difference. It channeled discontent into a tangible expression electorally that would be recognised officially internationally. And when that outcome was denied by Belarusian election authorities, that created opportunities further. We also think because she's a deviant case for studies of women presidential candidates in terms of how experience matters, we see that most well-qualified women candidates and occupants of executive office have to vigorously defend their extensive qualifications, traits, and skills. But her lack of experience was crucial to her being accepted as a candidate in 2020 by the Belarusian authorities and explained at least part of her appeal to Belarusian voters. As a more conventional case, she also represents ambiguous potential for specifically feminist political leadership. We think that she also her case also makes a contribution to gender and political leadership, particularly in authoritarian regimes as well, because often the literature focuses on how authoritarian regimes use women's rights initiatives and political inclusion, such as gender quotas, as a placatory measure to appease external influential actors and also domestic internal opposition. However, so they've also looked at things like how authoritarian regimes co-opt women's political activism, but this often specifies party-based authoritarian regimes co-opting individual women and women's movements. So we're arguing that the case of Belarus demonstrates that the type of authoritarian regime matters, in this case, a personalist regime, Lukashenko's personalist regime, for how it shapes women's opportunities for political participation and the way in which women can actually challenge incumbent impersonalist regimes. So just to briefly comment as well on our methodology before I hand over to Ruta. Our paper is based on analysis of more than 30 original expert interviews with Belarusian and non-Belarusian academics, independent journalists, analysts, and specialists involved in bilateral and multilateral relations. The large majority of interviews were conducted by our co-author between July 2021 and May 2022, and we're incredibly grateful to our respondents for sparing their time and sharing their insights with us as well. We also combine this with original analysis of Svyatlana's official testimonies and statements in bilateral and multilateral fora, as well as public and media talks. And this was supplemented with analysis of secondary data, such as from prominent surveys, reports, media coverage, and other literature. So I'm going to now hand over to my co-author, Ruta Skriptaite, to take us through some of our key factors and findings in more detail.
Thank you so much, Carol, and I would also like to thank the organizers. Thank you so much for organizing this beautiful event and for the opportunities to share our work. Thank you so much to the moderator for introducing me. And just to repeat, so my name is Ruta Skriptaite, and I am a final year PhD student at Nottingham University. My thesis, which I'm still working on, is on political image making and post-Soviet patriarchal leadership, a comparative analysis of Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. So now I would like to provide some more details about our findings in this paper. So our core argument is that Svyatlana and who she actually was did actually matter. And she's indeed a very unique case and very difficult to be compared with any other ones in the region or globally. Of course, we also agree with several longer-term structural factors identified by literature as being important to the 2020 election outcome, but attach particular importance to them for explaining Svyatlana's rise and appeal. So just to illustrate all of that, I will have this small structure versus agency discussion. I will try to be as precise as I can. So structurally, authoritarian context presents different dynamics and offer different symbolic meaning and opportunities for women's political participation in comparison to democratic context. Among authoritarian contexts, dynamics, of course, differ depending on the type of authoritarian regimes, as already mentioned by my colleague, for instance, personalistic versus party-based. And of course, the specific Belarusian political experience matters too. So the structure of political competition in Belarus affects and is affected by agentic behavior, such as Lukashenko's mistakes and Svyatlana's own self-representation, most importantly, how these are co-constituted, so how these two facts affect one another. Studies of Belarusian politics speak of managed pluralism and managed opposition, which limit the political opportunity for candidates. So it's another factor that we, of course, we take into account as it relates to the structure versus agency debate. Another factor, moving to Lukashenko himself, it's like his misogynistic underestimation of Svyatlana as a woman meant that unlike her husband and the other major challenges, she was considered as not enough of a threat to be refused candidacy. However, juxtaposing that with the views of the population, the voters, here she was seen as the view enough candidate and a credible alternative to support her in large numbers. However, it is very important to emphasize that her underestimation derived not just from her being a woman, because as we know, there have been female political presidential candidates in Belarus prior to Tsikhanouskaya. However, she was also underestimated because of being a woman who is not seen as a real challenger. In other words, if we had a female candidate with a slightly different background who expressed openly leadership ambitions and who had more political experience, it is likely that her registration could have been refused and we would have a very different outcome. Also, although Tsikhanouskaya is often labeled as an accidental leader or accidental politician, we suggest that it's important to emphasize that she still exercised her own agency by choosing to run for presidency. On the other hand, her self-denial, her channeling the tropes of a learning, honest politician served as disarmament of potential Lukashenko's attack on her credibility, and have so did her frequent self-depictions as political surrogate to her husband. Nevertheless, we also would like to emphasize that that our interview data suggests that despite this initial self-presentation as a political surrogate, soon she was seen as a leader of her own right. Also, under his personalistic dictatorship, Lukashenko's mistakes were concentrated and amplified on his own style, attitudes, and behaviors. And that juxtaposed with the self-representation of Tsikhanouskaya, as well as her personal background, created a very sharp contrast. So then again, so that again shows how her background and her self-representation really matter, because she having offered this stark contrast with, to Lukashenko, it's also in that way she also channeled this symbolic significance, and hence gathered a broad electoral appeal, being a symbol of hope, possibility, struggle for freedom, and above mentioned. So that also shows that voters were interested in change and difference to the prevailing norms, and this contrast offered by Tsikhanouskaya really became an advantage. Of course, we do take into account other structural factors. For instance, studies also point as to broad structural changes in economy and society. For instance, society, as well as the declining support for Lukashenko, as the public is getting wary of the oppressive nature of the regime, poor policies, and mismanagement. Some scholars even suggest and they refer to even to a breaking of the social contracts, and that is
Ruta, 1 minute, please.
Oh, okay.
If you could conclude. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So before I conclude, I just wanted to mention a quick counter argument. We do acknowledge the counter argument that people were actually voting against Lukashenko rather than Tsikhanouskaya. However, even taking into account that we really emphasize that her identity really mattered, and as well as what the message that she was channeling. Just to conclude, yeah, that was what we were presenting was just a snapshot of our overall project. And in addition to this paper, we are hoping to produce more that focus on Tsikhanouskaya's leadership after the election, the evolution of her political image, as well as her relationship with feminism and feminist activists. So thank you so much, yeah, for your attention. My apologies for overrunning.
Thanks a lot to both Carole and Ruta for your insightful presentation, and I'm sure our audience will have lots of questions, which they will have a chance to ask after all the presenters speak about their work. And on this note, I would like to introduce our second speaker, who is Anton Saifullayeu. His presentation is entitled Belarusian Protest as a Narrative Event on the Question of Terminology and Knowledge. Anton graduated from the History Department of the Belarusian State University in 2010. After that, he did a MA in Culture Studies at the Oriental Department of the University of Warsaw. He also holds a PhD in History from the same university, and since 2019, he has been an assistant professor at the Center for Eastern Europe Studies at the University of Warsaw. His research interests include post-colonial theory, cultural anthropology of post-Soviet Eastern Europe, Belarusian history of ideas. Please, Anton, the screen is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Victoria. It's a big pleasure to be here. I'm really sorry that I can't be in London right now, but I twisted my leg 2 weeks ago and I unable to travel, and it's very nice that we have a Zoom and I have this possibility to present my paper online. Yeah, my paper will be touch a very specific issue about, in more broadly sense, knowledge about Belarus, but on the other hand, the main narrative lines and strategies after the 2020 in the academic and intellectual discourse. In the first part of my presentation, I will present some kind of common attitudes of the knowledge about Belarus until 2020, and the second part of my presentation will be about on this kind of narrative strategies probably for the researchers, and how the protest was explained after 2020. Belarus is a very symptomatic example in the regard of template of the Western knowledge about the region. It is much more neglected than, for example, research on Ukraine. The external discourse until 2020 was essentially continuation of existing models of regional studies. That is a standard scheme of knowledge within area studies where there is a core, Russia, and accompanying territories like Eastern European countries. In the first 20 years after the collapse of the USSR, only a few articles directly related to Belarus can be found. Mostly that were book reviews. The majority of articles that analyzed Belarus or Belarusia are devoted to the general Soviet or post-Soviet context. And Belarus appears in them as one of the examples. Since the beginning of 21st century, several important strands, lines of narrative about Belarus in the English language academic space have evolved and remained unchanged until 2020. First one, political specification and geopolitical place of Belarus. It is during this period that the term Europe's last dictatorship expand to use. The narrative of the country in between, between Europe and Russia, develops. Second one, research, or to be more exact, the interpretation of Belarusian post-Soviet identity. First of all, it's necessary to mention here the linguistic factor and the weakness of the national identity. Historical studies, the third one, and essays. The Holocaust studies, ethnogenesis, some historical events, Chernobyl disaster, memory studies. For one, it's so-called suitcase science, like when Western theoretical background, critical theoretical background applies to local knowledge, local context, for example, in the Eastern Europe. And yeah, the Western critical theories applied to the Belarusian context, among others, feminism, post-colonial philosophy, gender studies. As a matter of fact, it is to suitcase science that one can attach the text that can be attributed to post-Soviet studies. Belarus is seen as a part of general post-Soviet trends of dependency, center-periphery relations, and neo-Marxist approaches to study of identity and nationalism. The socio-political crisis of 2020 in Belarus was briefly a dominant topic in research on post-Soviet Eastern Europe. On the whole, analyzing the articles concerning Belarus within the framework of the English-speaking academy, several changes can be noted. Several special issues devoted to Belarusian subjects have been published. For example, Imperial Journal, Slavic Review. A more empirical type of research was added to those four narrative lines, namely research on the influence of the digital space and social networks on protests and Belarusian society as a whole. Within the framework of post-Soviet and Slavic studies, the author's main focus was on issues of identity and Belarusian autocratic regime. There has been an increase in number of articles within external theoretical frameworks. The protests of 2020 certainly influenced the narrative of Belarus in Western academic discourse, but two events have returned the narrative of Belarus to usual these four lines of narrative. There are, of course, war in Ukraine and the migration crisis of 2021. These two events have put Belarus back into the geopolitical context, and for a while, the acquired subjectivity has blurred in general flow of knowledge of center-periphery relations in the region. But if we speak directly about the new phenomena in the discourse about Belarus, which appeared after 2020, several should be noted. The most important is the digital aspect of the protest itself and the way it influenced and has influenced society. Articles have appeared which consider, for example, the role of social media in the Belarusian protests in a more global way, comparing them to the, for example, Arab Spring or the protests in Iran. Accordingly, the attention to propaganda and to the informational aspect in Belarus has increased. In the context, the meaning of digital culture in the Belarusian context, also it has reached a new level, but the essence was treated in template manner. I mean, a profound ontological analysis never emerged. The digital culture of protest underlies the understanding how contemporary revolution or civil protest operates. And it is within this culture that the value composition of the binary position of the political and symbolic space of society is redistributed. With the end of the first decade of 21st century, we are entitled to talk about a new digital format for the manifestation, demonstration, and dissemination of the language of revolution. In fact, the problem is much deeper than it seems. I mean, the detachment of global knowledge from zones of colonial heritage and consequently the lack of legitimacy of the civil language of the protesters outside the local context. Ariela Azalai rightly draws attention to the disparity in the understanding of what can rightly be labeled as revolution and what cannot. But the digital space makes the presence of civil language in the public space more tangible. These changes have a double bottom. On the one hand, digital space is highly susceptible of the manipulative process and creates a quick and necessary picture in the informational space, which can negate long-standing attempts to build civil institution of oppression to regime's power. On the other hand, there is an increased mobilization process in a moment when the eventfulness is already taking place. The outcome of the real, in turn, often does not coincide with what the digital mobilization paradigm offers. but it is one that leaves a trace of liberation in the public consciousness. And this trace is important. It persists in the language, keep and fixes the terminology used and remains in one way or another in the minds of those who lost to the system. In fact, the key understanding of the protest event has remained outside academic knowledge. It is about the fact that the protesters were not seen as an eventfulness, as a logical coherence to the process that led society to 2020. There was no clear formulation of what the protests were: a crisis, a revolution, a protest. Apart from articles by, for example, Alla Leukavets or Tatiana Kulakevich with Jan Kubik, there were no articles that chronologized and categorized the event. In other words, the narrative was left without analysis of the underlying forms of eventfulness, traumatic events, and its consequences for society. In other words, in academic discourse, the terminological characterization of the Belarusian events is affirmed post factum, while within the eventfulness itself, the definition can vary depending on the extent of the confrontation between the actors, protesters, and the government. After the end of active forms of protest, the event is stated within global and local knowledge. And if the external, say, academic narrative of the revolutionary events assumes its subordination, for example, to the Western structure of knowledge through, for instance, Orientalization, the internal narrative of the event becomes rather an ideological phenomenon. In the case of Belarus 2020, in the academic text, the still recent revolutionary events are transformed into protests and political crises, while internally the authorities call the past events a coup attempt, terrorism, riots, while the civil language insists on the term revolution. Civic protest was possible in Belarus until state structure began to use targeted repressions on the mass scale. The isolation of civil language from the performative aspect of protests with the help of mass repression has resulted in its neutralization. Also, the violence of power structure in the active performative phase had been a mobilizing factor before, rather was spontaneous and reactionary in nature. Within the academic field, the laws of performative aspect accelerated the promotion of the events as a completed act of protest movement or as an intermediate stage, such as a further bureaucratization of the liberation movement. But the terminological reference to revolution did not disappear, but rather was transformed into a more theoretical format. A number of authors have summarized the Belarusian protest events of 2020 as a kind of post-colonial revolution of subjectivity. For example, Ilya Gerasimov, Misha Gabovich, Irina Romanova, Almira Usmanova, or Olga Shparaga, which discovered inclusive forms of identity based on horizontal spatial structures, a combination of old forms of ethno-cultural patterns with new plural horizontal or civilian forms. But with the passing of times and the deployment of counter-revolutionary actions, such a post-national project became possible only in diasporas outside the country, while inside the country there was a very sharp totalitarian turn. Digital solidarity is a rather circumscribed phenomenon which, as opposed to mobilizing solidarity in reality, depends heavily on narrative knowledge. This is less related to the moral principles of the participants in the revolution or protest, or the possibility of evaluating events, even traumatic ones, than to the dictates of discursive knowledge. The inherent forms of knowledge for society as a whole give rise to a terminological spiral of revolution. Even colonial experience will exist in civil language as a chain of association and moral counterbalances, both for the protesters and for the authorities. The language will be similar, but the ideological retrospectives varies. However, knowledge as such is hermetic in nature and its holders being already in the event, realized in the public manifestation of the event itself. In other words, knowledge manifests itself spontaneously in the real, but in the digital, it keeps the moment, fixes the moment of the event and picks up the necessary linguistic code. Digital culture selectively attaches this language of old knowledge to a variety of forms of solidarity thinking, but often limiting it to internal and external construction of knowledge. Collective thinking, especially in the revolutionary event, which is the subversion of the consciousness of the collectivity about the real, has binary universality. This is especially relevant in the digital format of collectivity. On the one hand, we are united in the solidarity of the revolution, but those who are not with us are against us. It is not possible to be neutral to event solidarity in this case, especially, and is often the case under the pressure of the national meta-narrative. An important point in the conclusion, an important point on the narrative strategy in the nearest future must be at the core of the consideration of the Belarus civil protest as an occurrence of the past events, and therefore subject to the influence of the accumulated narrative, for example, academic, journalistic, public. Hence, it is necessary to consider how we perceive protests after a long time of period when the external reality represents a completely different narrative dimension, political dimension. Considering the eventfulness of the past from the perspective of the symbolic dimension of reality, or from so-called Lacanian big other, in which reality will be perceived as something impossible, such as a traumatic encounter with violence. At the same time, as Slavoj Žižek notes, we are left to distinguish the real in its traces, effects, and aftershocks. In other words, analysis will be biased to a certain extent for the reason of working less with the consequences of the experience of reality than with the digital traces of traumatic event abandoned in the social-cultural narrative of the Belarusian context. At the same time,
Anton, sorry to interrupt you. If you could conclude in about 2 minutes.
Yeah, just 1 minute.
Fantastic.
At the same time, the post-protest intellectual narrative about Belarus remains in many respects a part of national neoliberal paradigm, both inside and outside the Belarusian discursive space. Actually, this shows us the regularity of the subordination of knowledge in the context of Belarus to the standards of central or semi-peripheral knowledge, like Polish, for example, in Poland, in relation to peripheral Belarusian society community. We have this pattern of thinking about Belarusian society as a Europeanized and in eternal confrontation with the regime. But the national democratic and neoliberal nature of this knowledge does not give us practical understanding of what the subject of research is, Belarus. It can be assumed that Belarus is still very far from acquiring its full subjectivity, even within the framework of research branches adapted to the region, such as post-Soviet studies or Slavic studies. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Anton, for your interesting and thought-provoking talk, which of course raises a whole bunch of questions related in general to the future and role of area studies. All right, I'm the next speaker on our conference program, and I would like to share my screen. Just a moment. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, great. So once again, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel discussion. And today I'm going to present to you the draft of my paper, which is very much work in progress, and which focuses on explaining the 2020 post-electoral protests. This is a qualitative study, and it currently summarizes some of my empirical observations and doesn't yet have a developed theoretical framework. So I'm going to structure my presentation in the following way. First, I will briefly introduce to you the research puzzle and outline the research questions. Then I will proceed to analyzing the empirical part in accordance with my sub-questions. And finally, I will conclude with some preliminary findings and my future research agenda. So let me start by saying that Belarus has had a long history of electoral protests since Alexander Lukashenko came to power in 1994. And many of them were triggered by the fraudulent presidential and parliamentary elections, as well as unconstitutional referendums. However, compared to the 2020 protests, the previous ones were rather limited in size, and secondly, they were rather quickly suppressed by the ruling regime. From the table on the slide, you can also see that not all presidential elections were followed by protests. For example, this was not the case in 2015. And in fact, the very start of the 2020 presidential electoral campaign also did not indicate any unpredictable results. A common point of view at that time was that the 2020 presidential elections would demonstrate, just like the previous ones, that the ruling regime cannot be defeated, that the opposition can be easily marginalized. So the rapid politicization of the Belarusian electorate, which happened over the few months leading up to the elections, and which resulted in protests, unprecedented in size and scope, this took the whole world by surprise. So in my paper, I set a goal to explain this empirical puzzle by posing the following main research question. Why did the 2020 presidential elections in Belarus lead to massive anti-regime electoral protests? And in order to answer this question, it's necessary to analyze various explaining variables, which I identify in my sub-questions. And basically, they ask what long-term factors and short-term triggers led to protests, and how their combination, how their nexus was amplified through the key enabling mechanisms. So let me now proceed to the analysis of the empirical part of the paper, which I structured around the three sub-questions. The first of them is long-term factors. And the number one, which I identified in my paper, is the gradual economic stagnation in Belarus. It is not a secret, and I'm sure all of you know, that Belarusian economy is highly dependent on Russia's energy supply and financial support. And when relations between Minsk and the Kremlin become strained, or if there are fluctuations for price of oil on global energy markets, both of which in fact started to happen from 2015, this has a direct negative effect on the Belarusian economy. So these two trends have led to dwindling benefits from Russia and subsequently resulted in a worsening economic situation in Belarus by the time of the 2020 elections. The second long-term factor focuses on generational change. By the time of the 2020 presidential elections, a new generation, a new so-called digital generation of Belarusians had grown up. And these Belarusians, they do not share the Soviet nostalgia of the older generation, which used to form the major part of Lukashenko's electorate. And the rise of this generation has inevitably changed the social and political landscape in the country, posing some challenges for the Lukashenko regime. Finally, the third group of long-term factors, which I'd like to discuss, focuses on technological change, in particular, the increasing role of the IT sector in Belarus. Before the start of the war in Ukraine, Belarus had been considered an IT hub in the post-Soviet space, and there were many IT companies here which used to work as part of the Belarus High Technologies Park, HTP. HDP was established in 2005 by Valery Tsepkalo, who in fact attempted to run against Lukashenko in 2020 presidential elections, but did not succeed. But it's important to understand that as a result of the booming IT sector, Belarus has become one of the world's major exporters of IT services per capita by 2020. And during this year, for instance, IT exports exceeded 2.7 billion, generating about 6% of Belarusian GDP. Another important result of this trend was that the rapid development of the IT sector in Belarus contributed to the development of an affluent middle-class segment of Belarusian society. And many of its representatives have gained access to advanced education. They got chances to travel abroad, and this provided them with new perspectives and capabilities to desire an improvement of the political climate in their country. As a result, many IT specialists in Belarus actively expressed their position against the ruling regime during the 2020 presidential elections. So, in addition to these long-term drivers, a number of short-term triggers distinguish the 2020 presidential electoral campaign in Belarus from the previous ones. And in my paper, I focus on three groups of these short-term triggers. They are mismanagement of the COVID pandemic by the authorities, Lukashenko's diminishing pre-election public discourse against women, and also electoral manipulations, including new forms of pandemic-based electoral authoritarianism. I'm going to briefly analyze each of these short-term triggers. So the first one concerns mismanagement of the COVID pandemic by the Belarusian authorities. I'm sure all of you remember that from the very start of the pandemic in March 2020, Belarus, to be more precise, Lukashenko, he adopted an outlier approach to dealing with coronavirus. He called coronavirus a coronapsychosis, recommended going to sauna, drinking vodka as the best remedies to fight the disease, and wearing masks was portrayed as absolutely shameful and totally unnecessary. Lukashenko's public statements about the pandemic were quickly picked up and shared in various social media channels where numerous users commented on them in a humorous way. And these comments and discussions, they quickly gained a very strong political dimension, especially when the situation with coronavirus started to deteriorate and resulted in numerous deaths. So by the time of the 2020 presidential elections, Lukashenko's positioning as a COVID denier caused popular indignation and turned a substantial part of the electorate against him. The second short-term trigger was Lukashenko's diminishing pre-election discourse against women. Back in summer 2020, during the peak of the electoral campaign, Lukashenko made several outlandish diminishing statements that the Belarusian constitution is not designed for women, and a woman would basically collapse under its pressure after a month in power. And in general, since 1994, Lukashenko has been constructing gender stereotypes in Belarus that Belarusian women, they are weak, vulnerable, and their role is limited to motherhood and family. Svyatlana Tsikhanouskaya was basically chosen as a weak candidate, as the one who would not pose danger to the regime. But Lukashenko's narrative of feminine fragility was very quickly, he had basically totally different effect, and it led to the unification of Tsikhanouskaya team with the representatives of other teams, with Maria Kolesnikova and Veronika Tsepkalo, and this female trio started traveling around Belarus, and their campaigning strategies, methods, they resonated with a great part of the Belarusian electorate. So the third short-term trigger concerned electoral manipulations. And it's not a secret that all the other preceding elections in Belarus were falsified. But this time, in 2020, the scale of falsifications and methods of manipulations were totally unprecedented. In my draft paper, I'm using Andreas Schedler's framework of the menu of electoral manipulations, and I show how the Belarusian regime had broken the so-called links in the chain of democratic choice, focusing on 7 links, which you can see on the slide. I also pay special attention to showing how the Belarusian dictatorship utilized the COVID pandemic and developed new forms of electoral manipulations, trying to increase its own resilience. So once again, the nexus of long-term factors and short-term triggers had contributed to the rapid politicization of the Belarusian electorate, but the effect of these factors was magnified through several key enabling mechanisms. They are successful face-to-face campaigning strategies of the opposition, increasing role of social media channels, as well as the rise of civic activism. So, first of all, never before political opposition in Belarus has been so united and so effective in reaching the Belarusian voters. It basically succeeded to become a symbol of change in a very short period of time. A catchy campaign logo, motto, we love, we can, we will win, the song changes, and the white bracelets, which became a symbol of democratic struggle. All these campaigning strategies were very successful, and basically they contributed to the rise of anti-Lukashenko sentiments in the Belarusian society in a very short period of time leading up to the elections. Another powerful mechanism was the role of social media, which was being actively used by both the political opposition, but also by the general public. And it basically served as a kind of forum for creating this alternative discourse that dismantled the image of Lukashenko as a strong man and showed him as a laughingstock, and later even as a parasite, as a cockroach, unable to care for the well-being of the nation. One of the famous memes at the time, which was very actively used in the social media, was Sasha's 3%, where Sasha is a short version for Alexander, and 3% implies his real support rate. Finally, the third mechanism was the rise of civic activism, and it manifested itself in the creation of the alternative platform for counting of votes, named Golos. The analysis done by Golos compared the official voting records of the election commissions with the photos of the ballots that the citizens sent to this platform. And based on the results, the elections were recognized as illegitimate because there were falsifications in every third polling stations. However, it's crucial to understand that it was the first time when the evidence of these electoral falsifications was gathered through such massive electoral participation by the voters themselves. During the previous years, electoral fraud was mostly detected by the international and national independent observers, but not by the electorate, not by the citizens. And during the 2020 presidential elections, citizens largely for the first time, they believed that they could change the situation and restore justice. And in massive numbers, they basically took the role of these national investigators by taking photos of their votes and sending them on to the platform, basically being determined to preclude their votes from being stolen. And although there has been no change of power in Belarus yet, in my opinion, Lukashenko regime has been weakened. It has been weakened by this unexpected wave of popular resistance and also by the subsequent response of the West in the form of comprehensive sanctions. So very quickly to round off with a few words about my future research agenda. My future steps would include developing the theoretical framework for this work, which would focus on advancing several strands of scholarship dealing with electoral authoritarianism, including on the microdynamics of authoritarian elections, electoral integrity in non-democratic regimes, as well as theories of political regime change. I also hope that the work will be able to generate hypotheses which can be later tested on a larger family of cases. And speaking about other cases, future research agenda could include comparing different types of elections, for example, parliamentary versus presidential, and comparing elections in different authoritarian settings, in consolidated autocracies, but also in competitive authoritarian regimes. On this note, I'd like to finish and would be grateful for your questions, any of your questions. And I will have to now pass the word to our final speaker, last but not least, as they say. This is Volha Sasnouskaya, and she will make a presentation entitled Scoring Political Movements and Its Exhaustion. Volha is an artist, researcher, and organizer. She works with text, performance, and visual arts. She intertwines the notions of festivity, collective choreographies, and the political within the post-socialist contexts and beyond. She is currently pursuing her PhD at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Volha, please, the screen is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the. Sorry. Yeah, I'm trying to share my presentation. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the previous speakers for your very insightful presentations. And I will now.
Connected.
Volha, are you with us?
Probably she disconnected herself accidentally.
Oh, right. Shall we wait for a few minutes for her to try?
Yeah, I just got kicked out. Not kicked out, but I quit by accident. So I will now present my artistic research in progress that deals with which deals with the political movement and its exhaustion and the temporality of a revolutionary event, which I approach through the notion of movement score. And specifically, it addresses collective movements as bodily movements and political movements in post-socialisms, such as choreographies of protest actions and celebrations. And the research departed from historical materials on socialist mass celebrations that were published in the USSR and were available at the National Library of Belarus, and from the experience of the 2020-21 anti-governmental uprising in Belarus and its suppression, followed by ongoing Russia's invasion in Ukraine, which is supported by Belarusian government and with the use of its territory and infrastructures. So the research has been largely conditioned by the current political moment and specifically by multiple crises of public sphere and political agency. And on one hand is the suppressed uprising of 2020 and war in Ukraine. But on the other hand, I think it's also a general condition of crisis of notions of collective movement and political agency after the fall of state socialism and the consequent neoliberal transformations and installment of authoritarian political regime, which I believe is not only a characteristic of Belarus, but also for most of post-Soviet region. As Anna Vujanovic writes about this condition, that while in socialist societies, the state was replacing the people and dismissing the public sphere as a democratic space for dialogue. In neoliberal societies, public sphere is in crisis due to disappearance of the idea of the common as such. And so public interest is seen rather as a sum of individual interest, and she refers to Hannah Arendt. And why am I interested in movement, particularly? On one hand, it's due to the fact that in socialism, state ideology represented and rehearsed itself through the bodies and collective movements, as in mass revolutionary spectacles, but also in everyday practices such as physical culture. And Anna Vianovic, for example, relates those movement practices to the notion of social choreography, a concept developed by Andrew Hewitt, as material aestheticized practice, a performance of ideology in everyday movement and dance, which accounts on how social order is introduced, rehearsed, and maintained. And in Soviet tradition, affective power of festival in Soviet months, a revolutionary celebration was claimed to serve the role to intensify solidarity and collectivity and emancipate from alienation and proliferate struggle, as Anatoly Mazayev writes about it. With the effect which, however, faded with time, and Alexei Yurchak writes about it through his concept of ненаходимость as not straightforwardly political practice of being at the same time within and outside the existing power discourse. And thinking about performativity and politics, I also refer to Anna Vianovic, who does not put performance and action in binary opposition, where act is real and performance is not. For her, performance is type of action that is both physical and discursive, and it can effectuate change of social context and break old conventions of political practice and express the power to install new ones, which one might not be yet entitled to. And political action is in turn also performative, as it requires critical mass of force and historical need for change of the circumstances. So what interests me is how the exhaustion and disassembly of socialist choreographies and this overlapping of multiple crises of collective movement and political agency shift the notion of politics in post-socialism, and whether there are new forms of collective choreographies that enact political agency, and in what way. And collective movements have been also really crucial for the uprising in Belarus of 2020-21, which is always the case in the protests, but I think in this, in that case, it was also something specific. So in a severely restricted public sphere of Belarus, political and social engagement of people was normally enacted through non-direct political activity as civil organizations and culture. And Olga Shparga, for example, writes how then actors of those fields have become one of key mediators of the revolutionary protests in 2020 process. But during the massive scale and duration of the uprising in 2020 and the diversity of forms of protest, at some point it seemed that the notion of politics and people's direct participation in public sphere was re-established. And at the same time, with a state monopoly on legislation and public speech, like media, direct bodily engagement during the protest seemed to be one of the major and efficient means of struggle, whose effect also guided political imaginations regarding the strategies and prospects of resistance. And the most common choreographies of protests were procession, like marches, walks, solidarity chains, and various forms of disruption or refusal, such as strikes, labor unrest, withdrawals, and walkouts. And I would claim that two essential characteristics of those choreographies, exhaustion and interruption, are crucial for understanding the dynamics and potentialities of the uprising. And they provide a different perspective on political action and temporality, where not only political movement, but also stuttering and interruption of linearity of revolutionary time, which is often imagined as driving either to a definite failure or victory, becomes a political practice. And I approach these forms of collective movement through the notion of a movement score, and I will try to share my screen again. Yeah, now it works. Okay, I can't share just the presentation, so I will not.
Perhaps if you would like to send it to me or to Yaroslav. And
yeah, I sent it, so maybe yeah, it will be easier. Okay, it's basically just images, so it's not very important, but just to see something. So in dance studies, movement notation is a tool to graphically record, analyze, preserve, and transmit dance and movement. And there are a variety of different forms of movement notations. For example, Labat notation is one of the most common ones. But in early 1960s, there was a semantic shift from dance notation to scoring when dance was kind of dance field and music field has been widely collaborated. So, and the notion of score brought new approach to dance notation, which implied less stability and more uncertainty and stressed the process of interpretation. And in my research, I worked on one hand with the texts and movement notations on revolutionary mass celebrations, which I also treat as movement scores, since they present certain instructions or command on how to organize celebration, which on one hand included several different scripts of organization of celebrations, but also notation movements and also like the guidance methodички, how to organize the events. And also those materials instructed my understanding of the concept of a score. But for this presentation, I will only focus on materials on 2020 uprising. And as I said, one of the major choreographies of the protest was the march, since it was easier to avoid police crackdowns, but also this choreography in a sense reappropriated and resignified, maybe not on purpose, official choreography of the procession of state parades. Yeah, maybe we can go to 2, 3. Yeah, this is like the example of Labat notation, and then maybe next slide. And yeah, so starting with general marches on Sundays with several hundreds, thousands participants, it then disassembled into neighborhood marches and then just a walk, since protesters on one hand disguised their protest as walk to avoid being arrested, and at the same time police could arrest anyone who would just pass by, label their mundane walk as a protest. So then there was this shift from spectacular mass protest choreographies to more mundane gestures. And every time before the march, the route was published, though the protest rarely managed to follow it exactly, since the police also planned their crackdowns. But in my work, I see these routes of protests, marches as movement scores. And both in terms of socialist and protest choreographies I'm referring to, there is a certain degree of exhaustion in case of socialist choreographies is because they become a trace of political ideas that are no longer present. But in case of protests, there is a certain bodily exhaustion of continuous movement, of a walk, of a political struggle, but also an attention of awaiting the attack during the protest, but also exhaustion of the march as a protest form as such, which urged it to transform. But when exhausted, I claim this practice becomes more of an exercise, or as Andrea Lepecki, dance scholar, puts it, a choreopolitical movement that must be learned, rehearsed, and experienced, and again, and renewed through this repetition. So I wonder how movement score of protest marches adds to the understanding of political movement and political event. And as a conceptual and methodological tool, movement score is crucial for me from several points, which is its relation to body or bodies and time. And score is always shared by multiple bodies who perform the movement and dance and then read it and interpret, and thus it troubles the notion of authorship, as Frederick Agis writes. And taking this perspective into research helps me to shift the perspective from I as an individual writer or researcher and participant of political event, and to stress the collective relationship and ownership of the event and movements that I'm addressing. And of course, movement score as a system has its limitations, since it's a system of knowledge that is not neutral and must be learned in order to be understood and used. And however detailed and nuanced this system is, there are certain aspects of movement that cannot and should not be transcribed. So score is not as much of a representation of movement, but rather an outline of possibilities. It is always incomplete and unstable, but so is the movement it is referring to, because a movement is always underscored by, the presence of movement is always stressed by its absence, the trace of a movement that has gone before. So SCORE is not a complete explanatory tool, but is a tool to stress what stays beyond the archive, what is forgotten, omitted, and non-articulated, what remains in the body and not meant to be shared. And this perspective is particularly relevant since I'm working with the official ideological representations on one hand of state celebrations, and on the other with the fragile, unstable, and incomplete experience of protest on the other. And movement SCORE also stresses the complex relationship with time, movement, and history. It connects past, since it's a document that notated past movement with the present moment of reading and embodiment, and then with the future, potential future enactments. Next slide, please. And working with the post-socialist choreographies adds another layer to this temporal complexity, since in socialism, future and its collective imagination in the experience of celebration and revolution was part of political project, while post-socialism is being criticized for being always characterized by its absent subject, by its past socialism, and thus being just a disguise of the future promised by neoliberalism, playing a never-ending catch-up to Western colonial temporality. And speaking from the present moment of crisis and political ruin, of post-socialism, of smashed revolution in Belarus, and then going war in Ukraine, I'm questioning the notion of aftermath, and employ the concept of repetition of movements, text, and historical events, or rehearsal that is embedded in movement SCORE to simultaneously address past, present, and the future of collective movement. Next slide, please. And writing about the experience of the smashed Grenada Revolution in 1983, David Scott addresses the contemporary aporia of the crisis of political time, and in modern historical time has been normally understood as a linear, continuous change that leads to some improvement. However, he claims now these rhythms of relation between past, present, and future has been broken or interrupted. And there is a quote, "What we are left with are aftermaths of political catastrophe, in which the present seems stricken with immobility and pain and ruin. A sudden experience of temporal afterness prevails, in which the trace of future's past hangs like a remnant of a voile curtain over what feels uncannily like an endlessly extending present, a present that stands out as arrested movement and can be nothing more than a melancholic repetition of itself. However, he claims that these catastrophic aftermaths have provoked a more acute awareness of time, a more arresting attunement to the uneven topos of temporality. So I wonder if this interrupted linearity of revolutionary time has also different potential, and could be that this stretched out present opens a space of possibility where present is seen as a profound and lasting temporal break for rehearsing and exercising future now, I quote, an event of enduring unfolding of effective connections, an effect virus through which new socialities emerge, as Isabel Laurie puts it. And next slide, please. So I wonder, what does it mean to treat historical document and event as a SCORE? Does it acknowledge both the untranslatability of the political event, bodily movement and effect, as well as the possibility of it to be activated and shared? And could the document or even the political event it refers to be transformed and unsettled through the act of its reading? Does it allow to establish a different corporeal relation to the archive and past events? And does it allow to establish a more complex temporal relations between the political events, archives, and projects, other than linear logic of genealogy, as in socialism transitioning to post-socialism? Could it also, by allowing to embrace the limitation of a SCORE as a tool of representation and part of certain ideologies, and to bring to the foreground the gaps, ruptures, and stuttering, not knowing, and inaccessibilities as significant and productive notions? If the exhausted movement continues in a SCORE, always ready to be activated, precisely making the interruption and exhaustion significant, and unsettling the relationship between past and future event and the document. Thank you.
Wonderful, Olga. Thank you very much for your presentation and for sharing your interesting slides. We are running terribly late, but that's not entirely our fault. We started our panel late, and I'm also aware I'm standing between you and the lunch. So I suggest to do the following, to take a few questions from the audience, and then let the participant, the speakers, answer them. and perhaps then to continue the discussion during lunch. I also unfortunately will have to join another meeting very soon. So I suggest we try to keep questions short and crisp. And please, when you state a question, briefly introduce yourself, your name, your professional affiliation.
Thank you very much. And we have two mics here in the room. Volha, would you like to stop sharing your slides? Then
It's
don't know
not
how
me.
to do it.
It's
Oh,
not me.
sorry. Okay, it's me. So do we have any questions in the room? Is your mic on? Maybe it's on mute. Check. There's a mute button at the top. Just shift it and then. Yeah. Try now.
Yep. Sorry, Paul Hansbury. So the question is for Anton. You said that scholars have failed to label the events of 2020. I just wondered what the range of possible labels are for those events.
Thank you very much. Sorry, but I can't hear the question. I can't fully understand because it's some kind of interrupt in my connection.
Okay. So you said that the events of 2020, scholars had failed to give a label to them. You said they just call it a crisis. I wondered what the range of possible labels are, given that it wasn't a revolution because there wasn't a regime change, for example. So what could we call it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you for your question. Yeah, there is a question, you know, because as I said, for internal discursive space, for example, for intellectuals from the Belarus abroad too, the most usable term is revolution, because in the Belarusian context is a big changes, is a big transformation process within the society. But for the researchers, for example, which are not from the Belarus, but from the abroad, from the representatives of Western academy field, it's just a protest. I can't, in my mind, the most valuable and most suitable term for the events of 2020 in the Belarusian context is a civic protest, because it's like, as you said, it's not a revolution, because regime has no changed, but it's a little bit more than just a protest like on Bolotnaya, or for example, like in Kazakhstan in 2021, 2022. It's much more bigger in civic dimension, as for example Volha said in her presentation, and this is some kind of crucial moment for the society, not for the political changes, not for authorities, not for this oppositional democratic or, I don't know, neoliberal national elites. It's a crucial moment for in a cultural sense, in a social, in a public sense, in an informational background, in an informational foundation. Is a crucial moment of changes for the whole Belarusian society from the 1991, and that is why, in my mind, the most suitable term for the events of the protest of the 2020 in Belarus is civil protest.
Victoria, by the way, if you need to go, feel free to go. We'll take care of, because we started a bit later, so we can have a few more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I have unfortunately to jump into another meeting, so I'm looking forward to catching up with everybody at 1. Same room, right?
Yes, same room. See you later, Victoria.
Yeah, bye.
Hello, Karolina Matskevich of the Francis Karina Belarusian Library in London. My question is to Volha. I might have missed something because I wasn't in the room for the entire presentation, but have you studied the use of traditional forms of choreography in protests, such as circle dancing?
Thank you for your question. No, I'm not focused on traditional dances. Yeah, for me, it's more, I'm more interested and focused not on the use of existing choreographic forms and dances within the protest, but looking at the choreographies that were generated within the protests by itself. Like, for example, protest marches and how they were then developed. Thank you.
But you are aware of the use of circle dancing in the protest. Thank you.
I have a question to those people who were analyzing the roots of the protests. There have been quite a lot written on it recently. Where do you think the gaps which need to be filled? Or are there any particular misunderstandings or misconceptions in your view about the revolution, not the protests and their origin, their consequences? Because my feeling that there was a very significant interest shortly after and during those events, but then the war against Ukraine has overshadowed everything, and now it sort of moved a bit to the background. But I'm sure that there are interesting conceptual issues and other things which still need to be analyzed. Any thoughts from any of those who were in the panel? Maybe the first presenter, some later. Any thoughts on it?
Yeah, actually, I would need just a minute to think about it, because I was like, sorry, I was just focused on like on the question that I wanted to pose on Victoria. Unfortunately, she left. So if any of the colleagues who are writing on protests would like to take the question.
Let me try. So I'm not here with this topic, but obviously I'm aware enough to try to answer this question. So to my mind, it was widely spoken everywhere, and it was widely supported by information in media and all these things. So like the biggest issue for now is to collect everything and to make this all the data classified. So there are a lot of information, and this information is in different places and in different forms, for example, media articles or video or academic papers. So it has to be made some database of it, to my mind.
To analyze what is already there in terms of data, but also in terms of scholarship. Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts from the panelists? Yes.
Yes, so obviously it's not a very original thought, but I just think that there is something that needs to be explored in quite a bit of depth. It's the way that protests reflect the gender norms. And you probably, most of you know that, at least at the beginning, in the Western media, there was a lot of emphasis on like it being women's protests. And that was like quite, in my opinion, like, from my understanding, was the intention was to name it that, just to like give positive connotations to the protest. But however, what such labels were missing is that they were putting women into back into this domestic category. By the basically what I'm trying to say is by emphasizing women's participation in the protest, they were also indirectly implying that it's like that it's not really women's domain. So I just, sorry, it's if I'm not being very precise, but I just feel that, the gendered aspect should be, and more emphasized, and maybe it requires more research and more focus. Thank you.